Betrayed. I caught my stepdad Logan, 52, bar owner, whispering secrets in our Chicago dive. I flirted, poured his drink, his hand burned mine, sparks exploded. Mom's away, 2 weeks uncovered lies, too wild. One truth shattered us, what broke our game? You'll choke. The Chicago night was electric, the hum of neon and clinking glasses filling Logan's dive bar, a gritty joint where I, Emma, 21, slung drinks behind the counter, my apron stained with gin and ambition. The bar was my stepdad's kingdom. Logan, 52, a former bartender with a shadowed past, his charm as sharp as his whiskey pours. Mom was off on a bookkeeping trip, her last text a dry bet I'd keep the bar running, way off. Logan's late-night talks with his business partner, Clara, had been too close, their laughs too intimate, and tonight, I was ready to dig. I'd felt his eyes on me, not quite fatherly, stirring a reckless pull I hadn't named. I was wiping the counter, my tank top and jeans sticking from the heat, when Logan leaned in from the back room, his faded leather jacket open over a black shirt, dark hair flecked with gray, eyes glinting. He muttered I'd better not overpour, bet I'd bankrupt his stock. I grinned while flirty, tossin' a rag, saying he looked hot with bottles, bet he'd mix me trouble. He smirked, grabbed a shaker, his hand brushing a glass by my wrist, muttering trouble was my dodge, bet I'd spill his best. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying spilling was my spark, bet he'd drink it up. I leaned over, flirty, pouring a whiskey, saying he'd run bars, bet he'd teach me a secret. He smirked, took my hand to adjust my pour, his palm warm, muttering secrets weren't my game, bet I'd shake it wrong. I pressed closer, my hip grazing his, flirty, teasing he was too strict, bet he'd brew something wild. His grip tightened, eyes flicking to my neck, muttering wild was my rush, bet I'd hook him deep. The bar pulsed, and I overheard him on the phone with Clara, words about signing the bar over hit like ice. I flirty asked for a shift change, probing, saying he looked sneaky, bet he'd spill. He smirked, brushing it off, muttering sneaking was my trap, bet I'd stir him up. The crowd thinned, and I slipped to the back room, heart racing, spotting a folder tucked behind bottles, contracts, Clara's name, a plan to transfer the bar. I grabbed it, but my foot caught a crate, and I stumbled, papers scattering. Logan appeared, catching my waist, his hands firm, pulling me upright, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a wreck, bet I'd wreck his stash. My pulse spiked, his grip warm, and I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying wrecking was my vibe, bet he'd save the bar. He smirked, steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing saving was my snare, bet I'd drag him down. I clutched the folder, flirty, saying he looked too good hiding, bet he'd spark my scoop. He smirked, took a bottle, his fingers grazing mine, muttering sparking was my hustle, bet I'd burn his books. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying burning was my thrill, bet he'd fan it anyway. The bar quieted, and I stayed close, teasing he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the counter, muttering flaring was my chaos, bet I'd shake him up. I leaned in, flirty, saying shaking was my bet he'd bite it hard. The night deepened, the bar empty, and I stepped back, folder hidden, flirty, saying he was too slick, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, turned to the till, his eyes trailing, muttering chasing was my trap, bet I'd hook him deep. I grinned, flirty, knowing I'd snagged him, contracts stashed, stakes soaring. Mom's shift was days away, and I slipped out, the folder burning in my bag, tension thick, bet it'd explode hotter. 3 days after uncovering the contract in Logan's bar, the Chicago night was alive with the clatter of glasses and the thump of bass in the dive bar, where I, Emma, 21, worked the counter, my apron smudged with lime and suspicion. Mom was still off on her bookkeeping trip, her last text a curt bet I'd keep the bar steady, not a chance. The folder I'd found, detailing Logan's plan to transfer the bar to his business partner, Clara, burned in my mind, her too close laughs with him hinting at more than business. Logan, 52, ex-bartender turned owner, had a dangerous charm, his glances at me stirring a reckless pull I couldn't shake. I'd been flirting to dig deeper, and tonight, I was ready to press. I was shaking a martini, my tank top and jeans sticking from the bar's heat, when Logan leaned in from the back, his leather jacket open over a black shirt, dark hair flecked with gray, eyes glinting under the neon. He muttered I'd better not overmix, bet I'd ruin his signature. I grinned all flirty, tossing a lime, saying he looked hot with a shaker, bet he'd pour me trouble. He smirked, grabbed a bottle of rum, his hand brushing a glass by my wrist, muttering trouble was my dodge, bet I'd spill his stock. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying spilling was my spark, bet he'd sip it up. I leaned over, flirty, pouring a shot, saying he'd crafted legends, bet he'd teach me a new mix. He smirked, took my hand to guide the pour, his palm warm, muttering mixes weren't my game, bet I'd botch the blend. I pressed closer, my hip grazing his, flirty, teasing he was too picky, bet he'd brew something wild. His grip tightened, eyes flicking to my collarbone, muttering wild was my rush, bet I'd hook him deep. The bar hummed, and we started bickering about the menu. He pushed for classic cocktails. I argued for bold twists, flirty, saying I'd outsell him, bet I'd steal the tips. He laughed, said I'd flop, he bet I'd bore the crowd. I grabbed a rum bottle, flirty, waving it, saying I'd show him, bet I'd mix a hit. He smirked, reached for it, and my elbow knocked the bottle, amber splashing his jacket. I gasped, giggling, snatching a rag, dabbing his chest, my fingers lingering, flirty, saying oops, bet I'd owe him big. He caught my wrist, light, teasing, muttering owing was my chaos, bet I'd stain him worse. I leaned in, my shoulder brushing his chest, flirty, saying staining was my vibe, bet he'd wear it anyway. He smirked, took the rag, his hand grazing my arm, muttering wearing was my snare, bet I'd mess him more. We negotiated a mock fine, I'd owe him a new cocktail recipe, flirty, teasing he'd pick something tame, bet I'd spike it. He laughed, said I'd brew trouble, bet I'd burn the bar. The crowd roared, and I stayed close, flirty, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the shaker, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd shake him up. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying shaking was my bet he'd bite it hard. The tension crackled, rum drying, and I probed, flirty, asking about Clara, bet he'd spill. He deflected, muttering spilling was my trap, bet I'd stir him raw. The bar pulsed, stakes soaring, and I knew I'd hooked him, cocktail mixed, secrets simmering. 7 days after finding the contract that exposed Logan's plan to transfer the bar to Clara, the Chicago night was heavy, the dive bar quiet after a rowdy happy hour, leaving only the hum of neon and the clink of empty glasses. Mom was still away on her bookkeeping trip, her last text a sharp bet I'd keep the bar in check, not even close. The folder I'd stashed, proof of Logan's betrayal and shady deal, gnawed at me, Clara's flirty laughs with him echoing in my mind. Logan, 52, ex-bartender with a dangerous edge, had a pull I couldn't shake, his glances fueling a reckless urge to pry. I'd been flirting to unearth more, and tonight, I was ready to hunt. I slipped into the bar's storage room, the air thick with dust and stale beer, shelves crammed with crates and files. Logan was at the counter, but I'd waited until he was distracted, my tank top and jeans clinging from a long shift. I rifled through a box, heart racing, when Logan appeared, his leather jacket open over a black shirt, dark hair graying, eyes narrowing. He muttered I'd better not snoop, bet I'd break his system. I grinned, a flirty, clutching a folder, saying he looked hot with secrets, bet he'd hide me better. He smirked, stepped closer, his hand brushing a crate by my wrist, muttering hiding was my dodge, bet I'd spill his stash. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying spilling was my spark, bet he'd cover it up. I leaned back, flirty, flipping a page, saying he'd buried deals, bet he'd show me one. He smirked, took my hand to check the folder, his palm warm, muttering deals weren't my game, bet I'd fumble the find. I pressed closer, my hip grazing his, flirty, teasing he was too sneaky, bet he'd share something wild. His grip tightened, eyes flicking to my collar, muttering wild was my rush, bet I'd hook him deep. The room dimmed, and we started bickering about his files. He swore they were legit, I teased they were shady, flirty, saying I'd outsmart him, bet I'd crack the code. He laughed, said I'd miss, bet I'd dig up junk. I tugged a file, flirty, daring him, bet I'd win. He grabbed for it, his hand brushing mine, and we wrestled, the folder slipping. I stumbled, tripping over a crate, and fell onto a stack of boxes, laughing, my tank top shifting. Logan lunged, catching my waist, his hands firm, pulling me up, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a wreck, bet I'd wreck his stock. My pulse spiked, his grip warm, and I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying wrecking was my vibe, bet he'd save the files. He smirked, steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing saving was my snare, bet I'd drag him down. I spotted the key on his belt, likely to his office, and swiped it during the tussle, pocketing it, flirty, saying he looked too good guarding, bet he'd spark my scoop. He smirked, grabbed a crate, his fingers grazing mine, muttering sparking was my hustle, bet I'd burn his shelves. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying burning was my thrill, bet he'd fan it anyway. The storage room pulsed, tension thick, and I stepped back, folder in hand, flirty, saying he was too slick, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, turned to the shelves, his eyes trailing, muttering chasing was my trap, bet I'd hook him deep. I grinned, flirty, knowing I'd snagged him tiki stolen, stakes soaring. I was scrubbing a table, my tank top and jeans damp from the mop, when Logan emerged from the back, his leather jacket slung over a chair, black shirt clinging, dark hair graying at the temples. He grabbed a rag, muttering I'd better not slack, bet I'd flood the floor. I grinned, flirty, tossed my rag at him, saying he looked hot with cleanup, bet he'd polish me shiny. He smirked, caught it, his hand brushing a bottle by my wrist, muttering polishing was my dodge, bet I'd smear his bar. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying smearing was my spark, bet he'd wipe it up. I leaned over, flirty, mopping a spot, saying he'd run dives, bet he'd teach me a trick. He smirked, took my rag to show a swipe, his palm warm, muttering tricks weren't my game, bet I'd botch the shine. I pressed closer, my hip grazing his, flirty, teasing he was too bossy, bet he'd clean something wild. His grip tightened, eyes flicking to my neck, muttering wild was my rush, bet I'd hook him deep. The bar was silent, and we started bickering about cleaning. He swore by quick swipes. I pushed for deep scrubs, flirty, saying I'd outshine him, bet I'd steal them up. He laughed, said I'd slip, bet I'd crash the joint. I waved the rag, flirty, daring him, bet I'd win. He smirked, swiped it back, and we broke into a playful duel, rags snapping, laughing, my knee brushing his thigh as I dodged. I teased his bar was stale, bet I'd freshen it. He lunged, smearing my cheek with a damp rag, muttering freshening was my trap, bet I'd soak him worse. The floor slickened, and I slipped, my foot skidding, gasping as I flailed. Logan dove, catching my waist, his hands firm, pulling me upright, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a wreck, bet I'd wreck his bar. My pulse spiked, his grip warm, and I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying wrecking was my vibe, bet he'd save the floor. He smirked, steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing saving was my hustle, bet I'd drag him down. I grabbed a rag, flirty, wiping a table, when a letter slipped from his jacket, Clara's handwriting, confirming their affair and the bar deal. I pocketed it, flirty, saying he looked too good hiding, bet he'd spark my scoop. He smirked, took a rag, his fingers grazing mine, muttering sparking was my chaos, bet I'd burn him out. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying burning was my thrill, bet he'd fan it anyway. The bar dimmed, tension thick, and I knew I'd hooked him, letters stashed, stakes soaring. I weaved through the crowd, my fitted top and jeans catching the strobe lights, when Logan joined me, his black shirt open under a leather jacket, dark hair graying, eyes sharp. He muttered I'd better not start a brawl, bet I'd tank his rep. I grinned, flirty, nudging his arm, saying he looked hot in the chaos, bet he'd outshine this dive. He smirked, grabbed a whiskey from a tray, his hand brushing a glass by my wrist, muttering shining was my dodge, bet I'd spill their stock. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying spilling was my spark, bet he'd drink it up. I leaned in, flirty, sipping a gin, saying he'd owned bars, bet he'd dance me better than this crowd. He smirked, took my hand to lead me to the floor, his palm warm, muttering dancing wasn't my game, bet I'd trip the beat. I pressed closer, my hip grazing his, flirty, teasing he was too stiff, bet he'd move something wild. His grip tightened, eyes flicking to my lips, muttering wild was my rush, bet I'd hook him deep. The dance floor throbbed, and we started bickering about moves. He swore by slow steps. I pushed for fast spins, flirty, saying I'd outdance him, bet I'd steal the spotlight. He laughed, said I'd stumble, bet I'd crash the vibe. I challenged him to a drink-off, match my shots, flirty, saying I'd win, bet he'd choke. He smirked, down to tequila, muttering choking was my trap, bet I'd burn him out. I spun, flirty, daring him, bet I'd last. The crowd surged, and I wobbled, tripping into him, my hands landing on his chest, giggling, flirty, saying he looked too good, bet he'd catch me. He steadied me, his grip firm, muttering catching was my hustle, bet I'd drag him down. Doubt flickered, was this game worth it? The contract, the letter, Mom's trust. I wanted answers, but his pull was dizzying, my heart racing. I pulled back, flirty, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, his hand brushing my shoulder, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd blaze this bar. I leaned in, flirty, saying blazing was my thrill, bet he'd fan it. The music pounded, and I grabbed a shot, flirty, but my elbow knocked his glass, whiskey splashing his jacket. I gasped, giggling, snatching a napkin, dabbing his chest, flirty, saying oops, bet I'd owe him big. He caught my wrist, light, teasing, muttering owing was my chaos, bet I'd soak him worse. The tension hummed, the rival bar electric, and I knew I'd hooked him, shots down, secrets simmering, but my resolve wavered, the truth too close. The night after the rival bar's party, with Mom's return from her bookkeeping trip looming, her last text a curt bet I'd kept the bar in line was a wild miss. The Chicago air was thick, the dive bar silent after closing, leaving only the hum of neon and the weight of secrets. I, Emma, 21, stood behind the counter, my apron stained, heart pounding with the truth I'd uncovered, Logan's contract to transfer the bar to Clara, his business partner, and her letter confirming their affair. Logan, 52, ex-bartender with a dangerous charm, had me caught in a web of flirtation and deceit, his glances a spark I'd fanned too long. Tonight, I'd confront him, the folder and letter hidden in my bag, ready to unravel his lies. I was wiping the counter, my tank top and jeans clinging, when Logan emerged from the back, his black shirt open under a leather jacket, dark hair graying, eyes sharp. He muttered I'd better not slack, bet I'd tank his profits. I grinned of a flirty, toss in a rag, saying he looked hot closing, bet he'd pour me truth. He smirked, grabbed a whiskey bottle, his hand brushing a glass by my wrist, muttering truth wasn't my game, bet I'd spill his stock. I leaned in, flirty, pouring a shot, saying he'd hid deals, bet he'd crack tonight. His grip tightened, eyes flicking to my lips, muttering cracking was my dodge, bet I'd hook him deep. I pressed closer, my hip grazing his, flirty, teasing he was too sly, bet he'd share something raw. The bar was empty, and I pulled the folder, flirty, saying I'd found his plan, bet he'd deny it. His face hardened, but he smirked, his hand brushing my arm, muttering denying was my trap, bet I'd burn his bar. I held up Clara's letter, flirty, saying it screamed affair, bet he'd squirm. He froze, then leaned closer, his hand sliding to my waist, pulling me near, muttering squirming was my rush, bet I'd drag him down. My pulse raced, his breath warm, and I tilted in, flirty, whispering dragging was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. The air snapped, but I pushed the letter forward, saying he'd betrayed Mom, bet he'd pay. He smirked, offering me a cut of the bar to stay quiet, bet I'd take it. Rage flared, I shoved him back, saying deals weren't my price, bet he'd lose it all. His eyes darkened, muttering losing was my chaos, bet I'd regret it. I stood firm, saying regret was his, bet Mom'd know. The bar pulsed, tension thick, and I grabbed my phone, dialing Mom, voice shaking, spilling everything, Logan's affair, the bar transfer, my role in uncovering it. She was furious, saying she'd be home by dawn, bet I'd face her wrath. Mom arrived, eyes blazing, confronting Logan in the bar. He admitted the affair, claiming it was business, bet it'd save the bar. She didn't buy it, saying betrayal was his end, bet he'd leave. I confessed my flirting, saying I'd stopped, bet she'd forgive. She wavered, hurt, saying forgiveness was my path, bet I'd earn it. I packed for Lila's, saying I'd stay a month, bet I'd rebuild. Mom nodded, saying rebuilding was my shot, bet I'd rise. I left, the city dim, Lila texting, truth's out. Bet you're free? I held the letter, Logan's shadow gone, stakes new, bet I'd shine. I was sketching on a napkin, tracing a broken bottle, when Lila plopped beside me, teasing I looked like a fugitive, bet I'd spill the rest. I grinned, flirty despite the ache, saying spilling was my spark, bet she'd guess wrong. She smirked, tossing a zine, saying I'd chased a forbidden thrill, bet it was a mess. I dodged, muttering messes were my rush, bet I'd clean it up. But the truth clawed, Logan's hands guiding my pour, his laugh at the rival bar, his pull behind the counter. I'd exposed him, but the thrill lingered, a pulse I had to quiet. That afternoon, I slipped into a riverside diner, the air thick with grease and chatter, needing space from Lila's questions. I was scribbling notes when Logan walked in, his leather jacket open, eyes weary but sharp, a notebook in hand. My stomach flipped, and he sat across, his smirk faint, saying I looked fierce, bet I'd run far. I leaned on the table, flirty, saying running was my vibe, bet he'd chased me here. He slid the notebook over, his hand brushing the napkin by my wrist, muttering chasing was my dodge, bet I'd hook him again. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying hooking was my thrill, bet he'd bite it still. We talked, the diner buzzing, and I teased he looked too steady, bet he'd flare one last time. He leaned closer, his knee grazing mine, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd burn him out. I admitted I'd told Mom, exposed his lies, bet he'd hate me. He didn't, his hand brushing the table, saying hating wasn't his deal, bet I'd haunt him. I grinned, a flirty, saying haunting was my win, bet he'd keep my spark. He slid a bar key from his pocket, inscribed with keep pouring. Bet you'll soar, saying it was mine, bet I'd run it better. My heart twisted, the gesture raw, but I pushed it back, saying running was my path, bet I'd start fresh. I called Mom, meeting her at home. She stood in the kitchen, eyes softer, saying I'd hurt her, bet I'd schemed. I swore I'd confess to heal, stopped for us, bet she'd see my truth. She nodded, saying truth was my start, bet I'd rebuild. The neighbors' gossip about our bar nights had stung, but I'd owned it, I bet I'd mend it. I chose to stay with Lila a month, saying I'd grow, bet I'd return whole. Mom agreed, saying growth was my shot, bet I'd rise. I left, the city gleaming, Lila texting, keys wild. Bet you're flying? I held the key, Logan's shadow gone, stakes new, bet I'd shine.